So the next component that we'll be looking at will be the data grid. So what is a data grid? So the data grid is used to add the table with bunch of advanced properties that we can add. So the data grid is used to add the data grid like a table of the data inside it, and the Material UI has two versions of the data grid. The first one is the free one and the second one is the paid one. So we can use the free version in this video, and now it is fully customizable. And what does that mean? So it is fully customizable, like you can add anything inside it. You can use it for CRUD operations, you can edit the content inside it, you can have forms inside it, you can asynchronously load the data inside it, you can asynchronously save it as well, you can have some icons inside it, you can have avatars of the user's image, and then you can have paginations to have different pages onto the data grid, and you can have all of the events that are supported in the JavaScript, like the double click, single click, and on mouse over, and an event. And there are more properties of the data grid inside that, and in the premium version there are more properties as compared to the free one. So it's a special type of component to specify or to visualize the data in the website. And now we can see the properties of the data grid as well. So the data grid has a lot of properties, but here in this PPT we will just discuss few properties, because if we specify all of the properties then the video length will be very long. So we can just specify the properties. So the first property that we have is the rows. So the rows is used to define the data inside the data grid, and the rows are the actual data which are linked to the fields of the data grid. And the columns are used to add the fields inside the data grid. So the columns have a field property which is linked to the rows fields. Like if we specify the columns as the field equals to the ID, so we need to specify the same ID in the rows data as well. So they are interconnected to show the data grid. And then we can see some additional properties like the pagination, to add some pagination to add different pages. And then we have the loading, if the data is currently loading, if you are sending a request to the server and the data is loading, so you can just show the loading prop as well in the data grid. And now we can just move on to the Material UI website about the data grid. So now we are into the Material UI website. Now you can see the data grid is a fast and the extendable React data table and the React data grid, and it is a feature-rich component which is available in the MIT and the commercial versions. So the MIT version is free and the commercial version is paid, so you have to pay for using the commercial version. And now we have different installation guide to install the Material UI data grid. So we have the MIT version, and for that we need to install a new package as the MUI/X data grid. So we need to install this library to use the data grid inside the Material UI. Now you can see this is the data grid that we can use, and now you can see we have some checkbox to select all of the rows, and then we have some fields like the columns, like the ID, first name. So they are the columns that are specified, and they are the rows inside the data grid as available in the HTML. And then you have some additional properties inside the fields, like now you can say you have the sort feature. If you will just click on that, the data will be sorted. And then you can have some more properties, like you can have sort by ascending, you have the sort by descending, and then you can have some search filters as well inside the ID. And then you can have all of the features that you can use inside the data grid. And then you can even have show and the hide columns. If you specify the hide, then this column would be hidden inside the front end, and then if you will add the show, then this column will be visible. And now you can see these are the columns that you can show, and you can hide all, you can show all as well. So this is the data grid, and it is a high level component that you can use to display the data inside that. And now you can see we have specified the columns as we have discussed the column props. So the data grid is there, we need to just call the data grid component, and we need to pass the rows and the columns, and then these are the additional properties. So the rows and the columns are there. So the columns, we have the field property, which is very important inside the data grid, because it is connected to the rows fields here. Like now you can see the ID and the field equals to the ID are same, but if they were a bit different, then the ID will not be visible onto the web page. So they are connected, and same for the first name, last name as well. So now you can see we have the ID, we have the last name, we have the first name, and the spelling of the first name and the first name here as well should be the same, because if it would be the different, then the data grid will not show the data, because the rows and the columns are interconnected that you can use. And now we can see some additional properties, like we can have a header name, like this is the field name of the database, and then we can have the header name, we can change the header name onto that. And then we have the width, that we can specify the width of the rows, and then this is editable. And if we can see the editable property, so we can just move on. And then if you will just double click any property here, like now you can see it is editable. And if you will just change anything, like it could be the cotton, and if you will just hit enter, then it would be saved. So this is the editable property. So if you want the editable, then you have to specify the editable equals to the true. And then you have other properties also, you can have a type also, if the type of that row is equals to the number, then you can specify the type equals to the number, and then you have description as well of the column as well. And then if you want to remove the sortable feature, then you can just have the sortable equals to the false, and this will just disable the sortable. And then you can say you have the value getter, and the value getter is like to get the value if the column. And now these are the all properties that you can use in the free version, and there are a bunch of properties in the API of the data grid as well that you can use. So we can just move on to the data grid API. Now you can see now we have the import data grid from the MERN data grid, which is a new package which we need to install. And then we have the components that we have the rows and the columns, which are very important properties. And then you have the auto height to specify the height of the rows, and then you have the auto page size, you can have the cell modes model, and then you have bunch of different properties that are available. You can have the get row height, you can have get row class name, you can even get the rows data as well, you can have the loading prop to the boolean, you can have a logger, and then you can have the on change function on the send click function also. Like if you will click any cell, like now you can see the cell click is there, and then you can have cell double click, you can have cell edit, you can have the edit start, edit stop, and there are a lot of properties which are advanced that you can use as well. You can have the filter model change as well, you can have on page change, you have a lot of properties that you can use. And then you have base text fields as well inside that you can use. And then you have a lot of properties like the sorting order and the sort model. And at last you have the SX prop for these different styling that you can use. And now we can just move on to the Visual Studio Code to test the data grid inside that. And for that we need to install this data grid as well. So for that we need to move on, and then we need to install this package to use the data grid. So we need to add here the npm I, and we need to install this package to use. So this will install the data grid to use that inside our application. So the data grid is now installed, and now we can just use the data grid. So for that we need to import the data grid. So we can just move on, and then we can just copy that import statement. So we need to import this from this package. So we can have the import data grid from that library, and then we can just remove the use state from there because we don't need them now. And now we have the box, and then we can use the data grid. So this is the only component that we need to call here. And now in the props that we can see, like we have the columns, and then we have the rows, and the columns accepts the array inside that. And now if I will now just move on to the data grid again from there, like we have the demo of the data grid. And now we can just get the columns from here as well, because we don't need to add the columns separately here and it will just waste our time. So we can just copy these columns from there, and now we have some columns here, and now we can just add here the columns. Like now you can see now we have the columns, so we can just minimize that. And now we can have the rows as well. Like now you can see rows are all of the rows that are the fields of the columns, like the ID, last name, first name, age. So we can just copy these rows as well to add the rows. So we can just copy, and then we can just paste here. So now if I will now just move on to the data grid, and for the columns we need to specify the columns, and for the rows we need to specify the rows. So we can have the rows equals to the rows. So if I will now just save, and if I will now just start the application now, so now the data grid will be then available onto the website. And now if we can see the code as well, like now you can see we have the ID, we have last name, we have the first name. So these field will be available onto the web page as well. And then this is the own value getter as well. So this is like a value getter that you can use to get the value of that name as well. This is a condition of the value getter that you can use, and this is a param. The param is the row object, and then we have the row dot first name, and this is a condition which is specified to the value getter. And then you can also see the description as well. This column has a value getter, and it is not sortable as well, as we have defined the sortable equals to the false. So now we have the error onto the web page. So I think we need to specify the icons also for the data grid. So we need to install that library as well. So we can just move on, and then we can just install the icon material, because the data grid uses the icons as well. So we can just move on, and then we can just install the icons as well. So we can just move on to the MERN tutorial. We can just add the npm install, and then we can just copy this icons library here. So we can just copy that MERN icons / material. We can just paste this command over here. Now the icons will also be installed, and then we'll be able to use the icons and the data grid as well. Now you can see the icons are also installed, and now we can just move on to the application. Now again we are seeing this page because now we haven't styled the data grid. So for that we need to style the data grid as well. So we can just move on to the box, and then we can just specify the height of the box as well, because the data grid component depends on the parent component to specify the styling. So we can have a styling, the height can be equals to the 400, and then we can have the width as well for the box, and the width can be equals to the 800. So if I will now save, if I will now just move on to the application now, like now you can see now we have the data inside the material UI, and now you can see these are the checkbox icons as well to select all of the rows as well. Like now you can see all of the rows are selected, and then you can have multiple properties as well of the data grid. You can have a first name, and this is also editable property. You can have a last name, you can have the age, and then you can have the search filter as well inside that. So if you will just search, the value will appear, and now you can just get here the full search as well. So you can just specify the starts with, and then you can have a LAN. So the LAN will be available inside the search filter as well. So this is about the data grid that you can use, and you have a bunch of properties as well. And now you can see we can edit the form as well. So this is the form that we can add. I can add my name as well inside that, and I can add there as well. So this is how we can use the data grid. And now you can see the last name filter has now removed that name as well. So we can just remove that filter as well. So we can just remove that, and now you can see all of the properties will be then available. And then we can just start here and then we can just search here my name as well. So now you can see we have the full name of the Nikhil Thadani that is available, and the ID equals to the 2. And now you can see the ID field is not editable. So if you will just double click over that, like you will see it is not editable. But if you will just edit the first name, like now you can see it is editable. So now this is about the data grid that we can use in the material UI. And if I want to edit the rows inside the data grid as well, and if I need to get the name as well, like now if I will now edit this last name as the Nikhil and the Thadani as well, and now if I want to get this name as well which is currently edited, so we can just get that also. So we can just move on to the data grid, and then we can just have our own cell edit commit, and then this is a function like when the cell will be edit committed, when the cell will be edited and then it will be entered, then this function will be called. And then we can have the params which are available, and then we can just console.log the params as well to see which field is currently edited, and then we can just get all of the details of that rows as well. So we can have the console.log that params as well. So if I will now save, if I will now just move on to the application once again, like now you can see if I will now refresh again, we can just move on to the inspect, and we can just move on to the console. Like now you can see this is a John's row. If I will not just remove this name, if I will not just add here this John as the Michael, so if I will now just edit, if I will now just hit enter, like now you can see this field is edited, and now we can see the ID1 field, like the field which has the ID1 which is selected, the field is in last name, and now the new value that is selected is the Michael. So this is how the form editing inside the data grid as well works. So this is all about the data grid that you can use, and then you can just specify all of the properties of the data grid. If you will just move on to the overview of the data grid, like now you can see you have the editing, you have the rows, you have the sorting, you have the pagination, and then you have a lot of properties that you can use. And then you can just play around with the data grid components as well. Like you can see we have the style, we have the localization if you want the localization to implement inside the data grid, and then you have the accessibility, you have the scrolling, you have the selection. So you can just select any of the things, and then you can just play around with all of these properties as well if you want to master the data grid. So this is all about the data grid inside the material UI.